Um, this is an introductory lecture to the poem Beowulf. I'm going to start with a kind of historical and generic discussion of the poem itself, and then I'm going to raise some of the difficulties of reading this poem, um, which are owing a large part to the difficulty of determining precisely when the poem was written and by whom. Um, I'm going to try to give an overview of the poem and some of its interpretive questions through a discussion of J.R.R. Tolkien's very important essay, Beowulf, Critics, which was published in 1935. That will be a kind of introduction to the poem itself. And I will reserve for a second lecture and a third lecture a discussion of the poem itself. So I'll have to refer to parts of the poem in this introduction. But again, my own interpretation of this poem is so closely aligned with Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings, is so closely aligned with his discussion that I just think it's important to sort of present the framework first. So, first of all, the poem, the precise dating of the poem, scholars disagree, perhaps as early as the mid-7th century and as late as the end of the 10th century. So that's a very wide breadth of historical imprecision. It's largely owing to the lack of historical records at the time, which is one of the interests that Tolkien has in the period. I'll talk a little bit about this later. But this period is frequently referred to, especially in England and Ireland, as the Dark Ages. I think it's somewhat of a misnomer. The Dark Ages largely, I think people think of these as dark without learning. It's partially true, but it's dark to us. The lack of historical records at this period in England is a darkness which puts the period somewhat out of our cognition. As Tolkien will point out, the lack of those historical records leaves us with very little to go on except poems like this. So the poems are the way into the historical period in a better way than any other history we might find. This darkness stretches all the way back probably to Neolithic period. The pagan, or this is clearly largely pagan times. And just are still attempting to rediscover or recover the meaning of stone circles in England, like Stonehenge, the Avebury Circle. There's all kinds of figures carved into hillsides, horses and white horses and men, and their origins in pagan culture remain a mystery. So this poem points us to a pagan past in England that the historical elements have largely escaped us. Um, that's why it's called the Dark Ages to us. There is no author. Um, this is typical of medieval poetry, even poetry later than this. Poems of the 12th century, the 11th and 12th century poems like The Pearl and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which Tolkien has also translated. We do not know the author. It's only with the rise of of Middle English and a poet like Chaucer do we have authorship attributed to great poems. So the poem is without authorship, without a known author. It's pretty clear that this is one author. There may be emendations and slight interpolations by other authors, but this is largely the work of one author. We do not know the name. The author would have been largely uninterested in his own authorship. And most people would have been uninterested in the author. The work was what matters. Okay, so it's a shadowy poem. The narrative itself, I'll name it, and I'm taking this from Tolkien. Tolkien calls it a heroic elegy. Many have classified this as an epic. I suppose that has some merit, since it does sort of articulate some of the key elements of a culture, and articulate it in high language, but it doesn't have the conventions of a Homeric epic. So it doesn't really fit that sort of category as of an epic, Homeric epic. I like Tolkien's definition of this poem as a heroic elegy. It's heroic because it deals with a heroic figure like Beowulf, and it's an elegy because it's a lament for Beowulf, the passing of Beowulf, but not only a lament for the passing of Beowulf, but for the passing of a pagan culture. And I'll talk more about this, but this is surprising in the sense that it's written by a Christian who would lament something lost in pagan culture. It's one of the more interesting aspects of this poem that I think is pretty clear from in the poem itself. The subject matter, so the narrative, the genre, right, of the poem is a narrative poem, and the type of poem is a heroic elegy. Subject matter is, of course, Beowulf himself. He's a Scandinavian warrior from Geatland. It's set in the past. Whatever time this Beowulf poet wrote in, mid-7th to the end of the 10th century, this poet is placing the action of the poem in a past, which also is not clearly locatable. I would suggest, and I think Tolkien would agree, that this could be a few generations before the poet. It's far enough back that it can speak or it can articulate anything in the pagan past. And by pagan here, I'm talking about British paganism. I'm talking about the British Isles, Celtic and English, not Greco-Roman. Right, this is a totally different form of paganism. And this would include the Scandinavian countries too. They all have a kind of similar paganism. So it's partly historical, and that creates a kind of depth, what Tolkien would call depth, because you can't say, 323. The fact that there's no real time period creates a depth, a kind of ambiguity, and a kind of legend, an aspect of legend. So it creates a shadowy past that escapes historical determination. And it's written in a kind of lofty style and diction. The translator of this poem, Seamus Heaney, who just recently died a couple of years ago, was an Irish poet who wrote in the English language. He refers to the poem as having a kind of mythic potency. It approximates to myth, even though it bears some of the elements of historical accuracy. Okay. What are some of the elements then of the poem? Well, the poet will undergo three forms of suffering or battle, and the struggles with evil forces, you might say. Grendel's mother, and the dragon. These are kind of going under encounters with the monsters. They're the central moments in the poem. The literary term that's used for a representation of a going under, a kind of transformative going under, is called agon. A-G-O-N. There's a kind of agon here, a kind of going under, a representation that has a distinct pagan sensibility that we're going to have to figure out. So that is couched in the pagan warrior code, which you have to be clear about this in recognizing the very beginning of this poem when Beowulf arrives in Denmark from Geatland. He is very proud. He is seeking glory. Most students tend to recognize him as a Christ figure, and I think that's only tangentially, marginally true. He really wants glory. He comes there seeking glory. Without that, he wouldn't be there. So glory, the desire for glory of the pagan warrior is central, and centers the cultural and moral fabric and contours of the poem. It's Christian thematic, which I'll have to talk about later, colors it, frames it. Through the eyes of a later Christian, Beowulf might be seen as pointing to a Christian prefigurement, but that's not how Beowulf understands himself. So it's not written into the characters, a kind of Christian humility. It's not there in Beowulf. So I think we have to keep these things in abeyance. It's a pagan world, early pagan, told from the standpoint, a viewpoint that is Christian, but not that far removed from the pagan world of which it talks about. And by the way, one has to recognize from which it's derived. This is written by a descendant of pagan culture, and not too distant descendant. The pagan Norse warrior code is colored by two things: loyalty to kin, and loyalty to a central chieftain or king who dispenses gifts In return, the king gets loyalty by the warriors, what might be called knights, early versions of knights. The chivalric code comes out of this. Right, so the warrior code is one of loyalty to the king and to the kin, based upon exchange of gifts, which establishes a bond. We'll see this in the poem. And the idea of a vengeance, blood code. So when somebody in that kinship is killed, it demands the spilling of blood of the person who did the killing or one of their kin. This becomes a code that one might link with the Old Testament, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It is fraught with difficulties that we will see are internal to its own cultural predicament. I want to suggest to you that the Beowulf poem is a representation of a moment of crisis in a culture like that, and Beowulf comes to establish some kind of equipoise from within the pagan world. It's not something that can be maintained for very long. So the great halls of these princes are the hubs of the value system. And so when we find Grendel attacking Heorot Hall, this is an attack at the very source of value. So it shows a crisis in the culture. And I want to suggest a crisis from within the culture, not necessarily by an enemy, but within the value system itself. So they're the hubs of the value system. Beowulf, the poem itself has this kind of double vision of a Christian looking at it. And Tolkien saw the poem as a kind of source, his poetic source, to recapture the kind of agon of pagan Norse spirituality. The monsters play a huge role in this. Grendel's mother, and the dragon, and we'll talk about the way that those elements operate. Its mood is elegiac, one of loss. I want to suggest all the way through. That's why I think the poem to call it an epic is to fail to recognize here's why it's not an epic. It's not written by a pagan. It's written by a Christian. So it's not expressive of the culture from within the culture. It's expressive of the loss of the pagan culture by a Christian. So its mood is elegiac. Not just the loss of Beowulf, but the loss of that kind of heroism of the pagan culture. Again, I'll talk more about the content of that as we move through. But it becomes a kind of universal form of the loss of the past, of all cultures of the past. It's a truth of human existence that we look back not merely with nostalgia, but with a pained feeling of irrevocable distance from the past and its greatness, and almost a sense of trying to recapture that. That's what this poem embodies. So it's not written from within as a celebration of a culture, but written from without as bemoaning the loss. So I think it can't be really characterized as an epic poem. So we've got a different animal here than Homer. Um, okay, the poem itself, the language of it, um, is modern English. The poem was written in Old English, which you can see, by the way, that you've got the Old English on one side. You can actually compare it with the modern English. Tolkien was not, Heaney was not a scholar of Old English, and largely performed this translation through cribbing, using a kind of dictionary. But he was able to pull it off because he's a poet, and he was able to feel his way into the language and New Gaelic, which he discovered as he was translating the poem, shows the deep link between the Irish and the English. When he translated from the Old English into the modern English, he recognized his Irish roots. And of course, that was a particularly important insight because the Irish and the English, up until about 20 years ago or 30 years ago, were at each other's throats. It was called the Times of Troubles, largely at war, an unequal war, a kind of guerrilla warfare on the part of the Irish, but nevertheless a war. So he recognized through language, Heaney did, the shared roots of the British Isles of the British, English and Irish shared roots. I think it's a kind of interesting point. So the poem has the form, if you look at it on the page, of two half lines, and on each half line there's 4 stresses, stressed syllables, not syllables but stressed syllables, and so there are four beats in a line, and there in the middle of it there's a caesura, a gap, a break that you can detect. There also is across the lines an attempt to reproduce the same sound. Sometimes it's consonants, sometimes it's vowels, right? But you'll have at least 3, sometimes 4 of the same sound twice in one half line and twice in another. So the 2 stressed syllables in each half line, a caesura in the middle, a gap, and then the repetition of sounds in the second half from the first half. The poem, this is an important point. Poetry does not require rhyming. Poetry is largely meter, rhythm across the line. And there are various different kinds of meter. We're not going to go into it. Here, this poem is stressed. It just stresses wherever. In two stresses in the first half line and 2 stresses in the second. So listen for that and the repetition of sounds across lines rather than rhyming at the end. Rhyming at the end is actually not the normal. There are all kinds of poems that don't have that kind of rhyme. Or rhyming across lines. So we've got a different kind of poem. We're not looking for rhymes here. Okay, so let me just say one last thing about the heroic elegy, and then I'm going to turn to Tolkien's Beowulf, Monsters and Critics. It's heroic in the sense that it articulates the pagan warrior code of desire for glory and heroism So pride is something here that's not attacked, but valorized and praised. It's an elegy because in this warrior code, death is the ultimate finality. So, strangely enough, what's at the center of this then is vengeance on both sides of this. And that is colored in this by its Christian writer. And so we'll have to think through that question. I think Tolkien can help us untangle this. So I'm going to turn to this essay, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. I didn't post it. It's a text you can easily get. I think it might even be available online. Certainly there are new editions of it everywhere. Easily gotten by an Amazon or Barnes and Noble. It's a long essay, 50 pages long. I'm not going to post it. I'm just going to present a distilled summary of its argument. Again, it was written in 1935, largely a response to critics. The poem was largely neglected. It survives in manuscript, but doesn't really have. It's one of those unique poems that doesn't really have a kind of, how would one say, an influence. It doesn't really influence poems. It's hard. I don't even think it influences the Arthurian legends. It exists kind of on its own and kind of disappears in a way. So when Old English scholars began, modern scholarship really begins in the early 20th century with a kind of textual reading of things. And this poem was kind of criticized and actually marginalized and considered really beneath serious study. And it's largely because of the essay that I'm talking about that Beowulf has become a central text, because Tolkien's theory then presents this a paradigm for reading it, which makes sense of the poem and brings its particular literary merits into the forefront. So it's important to look at Tolkien's text and Tolkien's critical approach to this. Largely the argument was that two arguments against this poem. The critics saw that Beowulf is clearly a pagan, but there's all these mentions of Christian gods, a Christian God, the Almighty Lord, Old Testament elements that show that the writer was a Christian, right? Knew the Old Testament. Actually, what's interesting is the Old Testament was the first thing translated into Old English by a writer named Alfred, a priest named Alfred, and a scholar. So the Old Testament would have been known. Those interpolation of Cain and Cain's clan shows that it's a Christian. So these critics saw the poet as confused. And Tolkien unravels this and shows how this isn't a confusion. Second problem is that it mingles a very high style with kind of almost cartoon characters. Grendel and Grendel's mother and the dragon lack a kind of, at least on first reading, a lack of kind of depth. So the question of what Grendel and Grendel's mother are and what the dragon is requires critical examination. And Tolkien does a great job of reclaiming a territory for these figures that makes them less than just bogeymen, like silly cartoon figures. Um, Tolkien also claims that the modern preference for tragedy over what we see here as fate has marred the critical judgment about Beowulf. Um, we we the sense of a tragic fall, right, that we talked about. Um, Beowulf, there's a sense of fate here that of doom, inevitable doom, that clouds this poem that modern sensibility just doesn't want to think about. So what does he say about the dragon? Well, he says that the dragon, and this is a sorry, there's a tractor going by here. I'm just gonna tractor driving by. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but he defines the dragon as a potent creation of men's imagination. Potent creation of men's imagination. Greater evil in a human being, but related to time, a creature of time. So the dragon, and Grendel's mother as well, occupy this middle realm between, an evil connected with human beings that human beings participate in some way. The dragon is something of us. Grendel and Grendel's mother are something of us, but also beyond us. And that's a scary thing, that some evil beyond us can get into us. Or we can be influenced by some evil beyond us to the core of our being. So if you think of the dragon and Grendel's mother in that way, this is a terrifying idea. I've written a poem on this. Maybe I'll post it. Dragonfly in Flight. It's me thinking about the relationship between a dragon in flight and a dragonfly in flight. An attempt to capture them. I'll post it. I like the poem. I think it's a good poem. So it's got a central theme that is not merely medieval and not merely pagan, but human. And that is, he says, the paradox of defeat inevitable, yet unacknowledged. I think we get the sense of inevitable defeat, but unacknowledged, recognized, almost accepted, but not resignation, not abnegation. It's never fully acknowledged, although it's recognized as inevitable. That seems like a confusion, but it's the great equipoise of pagan hopelessness and the battle, maintaining a battle that nevertheless is hopeless. That's a key idea in this culture. And Tolkien, I think, sees this as something that is necessary to be reclaimed in the modern world. We suffer a lot of defeats in our lives. They're inevitable. Yet we shouldn't think of them as inevitable. We should brace ourselves, right? So that element of pagan culture is one of the things that Tolkien sees as vital in the Beowulf culture that should be reclaimed. That perhaps has been damped down in our culture. Okay. So Grendel and Grendel's mother, as I've suggested before, are linked with Cain and Cain's clan. And there we find the fusion of Old Testament scripture with pagan culture. This is not confusion, as Tolkien argues. They're an element of fusion, rather, not confusion. And because the Old Testament is prior to Christ, and the pagan Norse culture is prior to the coming of Christianity in this period, they're situated in the same existential position of being hemmed in by mortality, right? And that to live like that, to live hemmed in by one's own mortality without falling into despair, requires a heroic effort, right? It's what Tolkien calls northern courage. It's unyielding will. And this is how he describes it. It's the alignment of heroism, human heroism, with the pagan Norse gods. The two of them do battle against chaos and lose. But nevertheless, they bind with one another in allegiance because the Marvel comics with Thor, especially the early Avengers 1 and 2 with Loki, capture this pagan Norse exuberance quite well. I really like those poems. I just watched Avengers 2 with my kids. It captures a lot of this exuberance. Again, because of the defeat, these gods ally themselves with human beings against chaos. In other words, pagan Norse culture has gods that die with mortals, and suffer with them. The Christian element surrounds this, and it's the Christian poet's probably a priest, by the way, because that's the only people that would have had learning and ability to write would have been priests. So a priest looking back at this, and I want to suggest this right away, not with criticism of paganism, but with a sense of its honorableness. Not that the Christian poet would ever want to go back to the pagan times, for many reasons, but that there was something of tremendous honor and praiseworthiness in the pagan culture that has been lost in Christianity. And it's that contact of this poet who does not... Now, this might have been unusual, right? To look back at the pagan past with nothing but disdain and criticism and judgment. Oh, they're all going to hell, right? That is not the standpoint of the Beowulf poet, that they're all going to hell because they're outside of the Christian dispensation. So that makes this poem tremendously interesting. The pagan element is not attacked and dismissed, but valorized. It's remote, characterized by doom or fate and hopelessness. And what Tolkien points out is that both the Christian god and the pagan gods are marginalized. We don't have them coming in to help Beowulf. We have a human story of human suffering and heroism. So the religious elements are both suppressed. If we would have the gods here in it would not have the same effect. But what we have here is the kind of the pagan gods and a certain power they're aligned with seem to be continuous with the Christian God, strangely enough. That's what's interesting. Okay, talk a little bit more about that when we get to the poem. All right, so what is the analogy between the heroism of Beowulf, pagan heroism, and Christianity? Because most readers want to jump to that conclusion. And Tolkien says that in this world, in the present world, dismissing any account of the afterlife, those who fight the monsters, who are representative of evil and chaos and destruction of human beings, those who fight the monsters are defeated. But the effect of the poem is to minimize the defeat. The possibility of victory barely glimpsed. That victory will be established by Christian belief, not existentially, but by belief itself, the hope in the resurrection. But it's not achieved in Beowulf's pagan world, and it's not achieved in our world. We still die. And for the Christian, it's still hope. It's not an established fact, right? It's a hope in the resurrection. We don't have the resurrection itself as a lived experience. That has to be passed through by death, right? So death still is the liminal factor in this. And it's that sensibility that Tolkien admired and wanted to reclaim. It's why he wrote The Lord of the Rings, by the way. One of the things I made clear in the course I just taught at FAU at the Honors College last semester was that his translation and commentary on Beowulf led to the writing of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. They're inseparable. Okay. Why does the Beowulf poet retain this? Well, because the memory of being a pagan for this poet is personal, not historical. He perhaps knew a pagan who didn't convert to Christianity. Perhaps admired that pagan. Or perhaps heard stories from a contemporary that were passed down by somebody he knew. So it's remote. It's placed in a remote past, but it's not remote to this poet. Well, maybe only a few generations before. Its values of vengeance, right, which are divisive and corrosive, still remain. Just because you convert to Christianity doesn't mean vengeance disappears, right? The temptation to vengeance is present in every person, even if they're a lifelong Christian. They have to struggle against that, against retaliating with anger. That temptation is always present in the human being. So that fear of sliding back into vengeance as a code in which the temptation overtakes the belief, it's still there. But also the heroism is still there. So you notice it's a double. It's not wanting to go back there, but it also is it's something admirable in the past that's lost. So it's a kind of paradoxical problem, and so it can be expressed as an effort of will against insuperable enemies and insuperable evil, which is our predicament as well, which makes this poem universal. Tolkien calls this the permanent value of pagan piety. Now, Tolkien was a Catholic, a Christian and a Catholic. To say that there's something in the old pagan Norse culture that is of permanent value, the permanent value of pagan piety, is quite a remarkable thing for somebody like Tolkien to write about. And that's why he wrote Lord of the Rings, largely to recover some of that. and to present it in new form. The poet raises the possibility of a good pagan here, and this may also disclose a concern for ancestors dead. Okay, I think one of the most important parts of Tolkien's essay, Beowulf, the Monsters of Critics, lies then right around the 3/4 of the way through, where he juxtaposes the pagan Norse culture with the Southern mythology that we've just read. And Tolkien asserts the superiority of the pagan Norse culture over Southern mythology. How does he articulate the problem here? Well, by saying this, the Greco-Roman world is a highly civilized world. We've seen it with a legal structure that's largely taken over by Christianity. The Justinian Code becomes adopted. The legal Roman code becomes adopted and codified in the Justinian Code of Law. So that legal structure, it's philosophizing, which through Plato and Aristotle becomes the center of scholastic theology in the medieval period. That all of these, the art, the forms of art, so all of these elements are taken over and absorbed into Christianity. However, it takes 400 years of brutal martyrdom at the hands of Roman culture for Christianity to convert Rome and to convert the southern pagan cultures to Christianity. 4 centuries of brutal martyrdom. Highly civilized. Strange. A question that Tolkien claims is never squarely faced. And I think he suggests, because the rise of the Catholic Church so colors Christianity even now, that those flawed pagan roots wind up getting articulated in the very structure of Christianity in ways that might be adverse to its own thinking. Okay, so Tolkien, I think Tolkien is saying Christianity itself needs a good dose of pagan Norse culture to wake it up to some of its problems. Okay, so that's one side of the historical dilemma. Why is it a highly civilized pagan culture with art, law, mythology take 4 centuries of brutal martyrdom to convert to Christianity? Pagan Norse culture, on the other hand, which is barbaric, no writing, no art. Its architecture is Gothic, misshapen, grotesque even. Its form of justice is one of vengeance, not of law. Is converted. Now here's the surprise. It's converted without the record of a single martyr. That doesn't mean there weren't any. But if you look at Bede's history, there is none. And it might be true that there was none. There might have been pockets of resistance, but it looks like the Christian God was introduced to pagan Norse culture, and en masse, the entire culture immediately accepted it. Now, it took centuries because of the nature of human beings and habit, and maybe even hasn't fully been eradicated. For some of it, the code of vengeance to be assimilated into Christianity. And that, of course, had its terrible, terrible articulations in the chivalric code and its deep problems that we find in the 14th century with the Crusades and the mess that the knights made of Christianity. So this stuff doesn't get eradicated. It just gets submerged under Christian codes, right? So, but nevertheless, the conversion to the belief in Christianity is an instant without martyrs. Okay, what's the explanation for this? The explanation is that the dying gods who align themselves with mortals in pagan culture was recognized as paradigmatic in the crucified Christ. So the southern gods, who are immortal but not very just, and don't really give help to mortals against evil, because they're immortal. They can't enter into the predicament. Only death and mortality allow you to understand what it means to be a human being. These gods never suffer that. If they did, it would be a total collapse of the religion. And this is why Christ was resisted in the South. Why do we want a dying God? You got to keep the mortals up there. But notice that puts power on the side of, and power and justice pitted against each other. Right? The pagan Norse solution is a different one, in which the gods die. Okay. Oh, you bring a dying god who also rises from the dead? That was the solution. They took it. They accepted that. So you see the difference here. It doesn't, and the point here isn't that Christianity makes the dying easier. I can't prove this. It's the whole work of the Tolkien course. The pagan Norse culture makes it a little easier. The problem with Christianity is that when it allies itself with power on the earth, it gets into trouble. But this pagan Norse culture never does that. So it's a kind of inoculation against worldly power. And I think Tolkien saw the need to reclaim that. Okay. Tolkien argues that the impression the Beowulf poem must have had on the first readers was what he calls the impression of depth. And this is a quotation, of a past that itself had depth and reached backward into a dark antiquity of sorrow. Creates a world of meaning in relation to the present, which is dimly recognized, but of major significance. It is an attempt to convey a world of heroism and elegy. I'll read a passage from it. He says, "It is just because the main foes of Beowulf are inhuman that the story is larger and more significant than this imagery poem of a great king's fall. It glimpses the cosmic and moves with the thought of all men concerning the fate of human life and efforts. It stands amid but above the petty wars of princes and surpasses the dates and limits of historical periods, however important. At the beginning and during its process, and most of all at the end, we look down as if from a visionary height upon the house of man in the valley of the world." I think a beautiful way of describing the human predicament. So we've got a poem of deep human significance. that needs to be reclaimed. Let's see. All right, just a couple more quotations and I'll finish this. Tolkien states that the author knows of the promise of heaven, whereas the Danes and the Geats, those figures in the poem, do not. And I think this is something we should keep in mind in reading this. He says, trying to find this passage. Sorry, I know it's in there somewhere. Sorry, this is a passage I'm looking for. It's escaping me. It's odd. Why can't I find it? Well, I think it's best to just summarize it as the predicament of the Beowulf the characters in the poem of you have this talk of the Almighty God and fate as being synonymous, but you don't have a sense of resurrection that distinguishes Christianity. So even Hrothgar, who seems to quote Scripture, doesn't affirm the resurrection. That's an important point. However, hell is a reality. In Beowulf, Tolkien says there is hell. Justly the poets and the people he depicted that they remembered hell. There is practically, however, no clear reference to heaven as its opposite. To heaven, that is a place or state of reward of eternal bliss in the presence of God. That's an important point. Again, the evil is that's to be defeated, and the possibility of falling into damnation is what makes the poem so heroic. There's no mention of its opposite. So think about this. There's very little reward here for fighting against evil. You could become evil. To fight against evil is the temptation to become it. So there's no reward. And that is an important point in the poem that you have to keep in mind. So where do the just heathen go? He says he does not tell us, saying simply that Beowulf's spirit departed to whatever judgment awaits such just men, though we may take it that this comment implies that it was not destined to the fiery hell of punishment, being reckoned among the good. There is in any case here no doubt of the transmutation of words originally pagan. Right? So it's an open question. Right? And remember, the Beowulf poet is a Christian. So the possibility for the Beowulf poet of Beowulf going to heaven is open. Beowulf himself would not have seen that as a possibility because he didn't know Christianity. He says the whole story. See if I can find this passage. It's the last one I want to read. Not sure why I can't find it. Sorry. Looking for the passage. Yeah, I can't find it. Maybe my eyes are getting bad. Maybe I'll just point this out. Beowulf refers sparingly to God except as the arbiter of critical events, and then principally as Metode, in which the idea of God approaches nearest to the old fate. We have in Beowulf's language little differentiation of God and fate. Um, so the contact with Almighty Lord there refers to this kind of overarching idea of something in 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 control of destiny, but that seems to be the content, the positive content for the Beowulf poet. What Beowulf would refer to as fate, the Christian poet would think of as God or Almighty God. Um, so again, I think Tolkien saw this as important to reclaim this sense of fighting evil just because it should be fought, not because of reward. Um, and I think the pagan Norse culture is articulating that idea much better, actually, as articulating it. And the southern pagan culture does not. So that's an hour lecture. I'll end there. Um, I'll have more to say about Tolkien in the next lecture, but this will stand as your introduction to Beowulf, which you should begin reading, um, you know, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, um, in preparation for next week, so that it's not too much reading all at once. And again, it's good to watch this video right now. So I will see you for the second lecture soon.